experience that I really want to convey and that I try to talk about a little bit in the book. I had two experiences after graduating and staying in school for as long as I could possibly justify without my in-laws totally turning on me and suggesting that I support their daughter in a little more appropriate fashion. And the two experiences I had, I spent an enormous number of hours, probably 35,000 hours, doing psychotherapy with people. And that's an extraordinary experience when you just keep sitting there hour after hour, listening to people and trying to understand how their mind is working. You get an extraordinary, it's like a microscope into the mind. And you know, you read all these books in school. It can be Freud, it can be Skinner, or whatever theoretical orientation. And once you actually start sitting with people, that all goes out the window. And what you begin to see is an extraordinary process of the way in which the mind works. Now, there are two things that struck me about the mind. One is a good thing. The mind is able to create what we call reality, a reality sense. Now, we all take it for granted. Reality is just out there, and we just perceive it. Well, it isn't that way. We are all being bombarded with all kinds of external stimulus, all kinds of things that are impinging upon us, and we have to select which of those things we're going to take in and pay attention to. And we all do it differently. What's significant and salient to me is not significant and salient necessarily to you. If my wife and I go down the street, she will notice every house on the block, and I will be lost in some vague, abstract thought. And it creates a very different kind of sense of reality that people get. So it's the myriad of differences in which the way people construct reality is something that I believe we have to all get much more cognizant of before we start killing each other and are unable to appreciate that the differences that exist are not just a function of good and evil, but they're actually differences in the way our mind sorts out what things we're going to take in, what things we're going to sort out, extrude. Now, the other thing about the mind that struck me is we think of the mind working rationally. We think of thought moving from A to B to C, or 1, 2, 3. Well, when you begin to see how the mind actually works, even as it's knitting together this sense of what's real and what's not real, the mind doesn't work that way. The mind works 7, J, boing, and it will slip off in all manner of directions. And it is not at all the rationally knit together apparatus that we think it is. So I've spent a lot of time just listening to mock jurors deliberate. You know, when lawyers are going to have a trial, they'll run mock cases and they'll have jurors come in and deliberate on their cases. And it's a terrifying experience because what you see is that it's more like a pinball machine where the verdict, you put the ball in, you pull the lever back, and the ball goes shooting every which way, and then out comes the jury's verdict. And it's not a lot more rational than that. So the mind is a very chaotic enterprise. The miracle is that we're all able to walk around with a pretty comfortable, cohesive sense of what's real and what's not real. Now, the problem, and the thing that I think is really playing havoc with our country and dividing our country terribly, is it's not only that the mind can create this reality sense that we each have, idiosyncratic though it may be, but the mind has to do that. If the mind feels threatened in its ability to come up with a comfortable sense of what's going on in terms of the important things in our life, we get very, very anxious. Now, in its extreme form, that's what mental illness is. People get so fragmented, they can't make sense of anything. But here, in this case, what I think has happened to our country is we've had tremendous traumas. 9/11 was a tremendous trauma. The pace of change in general has been very traumatic. And we have to integrate all of these things into our sense of reality. So people are under a lot of stress. Now that's kind of the presenting problem. And that's the model of the mind that I go into in a lot more detail in the first couple chapters of the book. So the question is, if people are in a situation where they're vulnerable and they can be rendered scared by precipitous change or by psychological trauma, if there is someone who wants to manipulate us, politicians wouldn't be coming to anybody's mind right now, I'm sure. But if someone wanted to manipulate us, they can zero in on certain parts of the mind and really play havoc with our ability to think rationally. Now, what I'm arguing in State of Confusion is that the state of confusion is created in part by a vulnerable mind. Our minds are imperfect. Second, it's made a lot worse by the pace of change we're going through and by national traumas such as 9/11. But third, I'm arguing that the form of political communication is targeted to specific areas of vulnerability in the mind. And in the book, and I won't go into these in great detail now, but in the book, I focus on three particular areas where I think the mind is very vulnerable and where we're seeing how disruptions in those areas of the mind are playing havoc with people's ability just to focus on what our national problems are. I don't care whether one is for or against the war in Iraq. I personally, and you'll see in reading the book, I think it was a disastrous decision. Nonetheless, it seems to me we are all better off if we could deliberate from a rational perspective. And there were a lot of reasons why, with 9/11, we weren't able to have that rational discussion. They are basically psychological reasons. When we are anxious, particularly about our personal space being invaded, we go crazy. It's a bit like the metaphor of having a sharp stick poked in the eye. 9/11 was one of the very few times, other than Pearl Harbor, it's hard to think of any time when our physical space was invaded by a foreign force. And if you think back on Pearl Harbor, one of the things that was interesting about Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt was not able to convince us to go to war against Hitler until our country was attacked internally, across our borders, by the Japanese. And what I'm arguing there is that it was the violation of our boundaries that have profound psychological ramifications for individuals that Roosevelt was able to convince us to go to war. And the same way, 9/11, because it pierced our boundaries, it really made us, it discombobulated us and made us very irrational as a country. We were in a state of paranoia. And regardless of what the decision should have been, that's a very dangerous state in which to make a decision. Had Kennedy been in that state during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world would have gone into a conflagration. So the paranoid mechanisms of the mind, I'm saying, are things we've got to become very, very familiar with. And I spend some time in the book talking about how those mechanisms work, why they're so profoundly powerful. I'm also pointing out in the book, if you look at this from the Middle East, and you look at what it's like for people in the Middle East, when the United States puts military bases in the Middle East, which they haven't asked for, and when they're there, the sense of intrusion and the sense of spatial violation that creates for people in those countries, it's very easy to minimize the impact that those things have. But if we're going to understand the people, whether we're fighting them or trying to win them over and form an alliance, if we don't appreciate the impact of paranoia on their minds, we're not going to be able to deal with them effectively.